Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Facebook Live today. So glad to see you all joining us here in the audience from all over the world. We have a fabulous session lined up for you today, no matter where you are joining us from, whether it be in the US, where it is Memorial Day. Thank you so much for joining us. Or if you're elsewhere in the world and you'd like to learn about your ancestors who served their country, we are excited to bring you today's session. Before I get into it and we introduce our speaker for the day, I just want to let you know about a promotion that we have going on here at MyHeritage. We currently have all military records on MyHeritage available to search for free. It's in honor of Memorial Day in the United States, but of course, you can access all of our military records from all over the world, no matter where you are located. So we hope that you take advantage of that, and we'll put a link to those free records in the comments. I see some of you writing in the comments. If you haven't yet, please do let us know where you're joining us from today. We typically have viewers from all over the world. I see Megan said, Esther, nice to see you again. Nice to see you too, Megan. Thank you for joining us today. Fabulous to see you in our audience. We have Petra from Czechia. We have, we have viewers from all over the world. So thank you so much for joining us. If you haven't yet, please let us know what's doing in your part of the world, where you're joining us from. We'd love to read all the comments and see where you are all located. So thank you all for joining us. Let's see, we have Sarah from Ontario, Canada. That's where I'm originally from, Sarah. Nice to meet you. We have Linda from Oklahoma, Tracy also from Oklahoma. Let's see, we have Anne from Sweden, Charles from Michigan. Great to see you all. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us. So as I said, we have military records that are being offered for free on MyHeritage, and tomorrow is the last day. Today is Memorial Day in the United States, but no matter where you're located in the world, please do take advantage of that, and we've put a link in the comments section. So today, in honor of Memorial Day, we have James Tanner, and he will be speaking about family records of the Great War, 1914 to 1918. So a fabulous and exciting session that we have lined up. Before we get into today's session, I just want to let you know about a draw that we have for today. So we will be giving away a MyHeritage Complete Plan. And the MyHeritage Complete Plan is the best plan that we have to offer at MyHeritage. It'll give you unlimited access to 13 billion historical records. That's all the records that we talk about today, historical records on MyHeritage. It will also give you access to advanced DNA features, unlimited access to all of our photo tools. So if you've been paying attention to news happening at MyHeritage last week, we introduced a new photo tool called Photo Repair. And Photo Repair just magically removes scratches and creases, tears that you might have in old photos. So sometimes old photos haven't been stored properly, or just having been around for a long time, they just have accumulated just pieces of, dots and just some damage. So using the Photo Repair on MyHeritage, it now just wipes it away almost instantaneously. So it's really an exciting photo feature to add to the MyHeritage photo toolbox. We hope to do a Facebook Live specifically about Photo Repair sometime soon. So make sure to stay tuned. So that is included in the MyHeritage Complete Plan, as well as all of our other photo tools. That's Deep Nostalgia, the MyHeritage Photo Enhancer, MyHeritage in Color. So the Complete Plan is really a fantastic prize, and we'll be giving that away to one lucky winner. So to enter today's draw, just let us know if you have a family member who has served in the military, who served for their country, and what you learned about them through MyHeritage. We would love to hear about that. So leave us a comment in the comments section. And if you don't have a story to tell us, then leave a comment or a question that you might have for James, and you will also be entered in today's draw. So we'll be giving that away right before the questions right after the questions, at the end of today's session. So we will also be putting a link. I know I spoke a little bit about the Photo Repair, our new photo tool. We'll also put a link in the comment section for anyone who hasn't read up about the MyHeritage Photo Repair tool yet. So we'll put a link there and you can all take a look later. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker. We're very excited about today's session. Always a pleasure to have James Tanner with us. He has, I think, over 40 years of genealogical research. He's an avid blogger. His blog is Genealogy Star, and we'll put a link to that as well in the comment section. And he's just so knowledgeable about all things genealogy. He has spoken about numerous topics here for us on different Facebook Lives. We suggest that you all go check them out after today's session because they are all just so informative. So I'll bring him on to say hello. Let's see if we can get him onto the screen now. Hello, James.
Oh, hello. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here. It's an interesting day, Memorial Day. So
a great time to commemorate those ancestors of ours that served in the military.
Yes, it is here in the United States. It's called Armistice Day originally, but that's kind of celebrated in some cases in other countries also. So it's quite an interesting holiday.
And we're excited to learn more.
Yeah, it's changed into memorializing all of the veterans who have fought in the wars. So it's more of a veterans celebration day. Yeah, nice to be here. Glad to take any questions. And just a short mention, I think that the photographic tools are fabulous. One of my other alter egos is that I am a professional photographer. Some of the things that the tools do are things that I never believed you could do with photographs, even with expensive photographic editing tools. So it's quite amazing.
Fantastic. Yeah, we just, such fantastic feedback just coming in from every single one of these tools. And I love just seeing those before and after photos of what people do with them. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's just wonderful.
Fantastic. So should I bring your slides up?
Sure, absolutely.
Great. So let me put those in here. There we go.
Okay, so we're ready to go, huh?
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. I'm James Tanner, and as mentioned, and a couple of little background things that might help to give you some of my perspective. Not only have I been involved in genealogy for a little bit more than half of my lifetime, but I have also been I've done a lot of other things. But one of the things that I found over the years is that I have quite a heritage of people in the military. I have discovered that I do have ancestors who were associated with or fought in the American Revolutionary War. I have ancestors who fought in the American Civil War back in the 1860s, and I have my grandfather who was a veteran of World War I, who we'll talk about a little bit today, and my father, who was a veteran of World War II. And now I am also a veteran. I was in the Army for 8 years. I served primarily as a military intelligence officer in Panama, in the canal, and we lived in the Canal Zone, which does no longer exist. And so I was very much involved in the military. So we have quite a long heritage of my family of being involved directly in military. So it's kind of an interesting, and I have spent a considerable amount of time doing research into military records of all kinds, and are very familiar with the records here in the United States, and know about military records in a lot of other countries that are very useful. One set of records I've been familiar with recently are the military records in Italy, because they turn out to be very valuable in tracking almost every male in the country uh, during extensive periods of time that they've been in effect. Okay, let's move ahead here. World War I, or the war to end all wars, which obviously did not happen, was fought from 1914 to 1918 and involved all of those countries that are listed down there: Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire. Central Powers fought against Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Romania, Japan, and the United States. They were the Allied powers. There were other battles, and because of all of these people and the empires at the time, the Russian Empire, the French Empire, the British Empire, and all of those countries, and the German Empire, and many of the people in all of the places in the United States was involved with. That involved people around the world, and it was a tremendous war where millions of people died, and it probably affected your ancestors no matter where they were in the world at the time. But if they were involved directly in the war, then that makes a tremendous difference in the kinds of records that you might want to be involved with. This is the American Cemetery and Memorial in France, and the World War I Memorial, and it touched the lives, as I just mentioned, of millions of people around the world. There's nothing really that like the big wars, the World War I, World War II, that have touched so many people. Since then, of course, we've had a number of regional wars, and there are wars going on currently, and it's a sort of a constant background to our lives. But as genealogists, we need to realize that our involvement of our families and our ancestors and our relatives in the various military actions around the world will create records, and those records are valuable for finding out information about their lives. And this is particularly valuable if one of your relatives happened to be a casualty of the war, because that may be something that you were not aware of, and you may have a direct connection with one of these cemeteries out there. But we need to also understand that the people who are not directly involved in the war, and I'm going to focus primarily on World War I, were also affected, the individuals, members of their family who were serving, and in other ways. I'm going to mention other wars because the record sets are really kind of focused on each war. So if you find out that your ancestors lived during a particular time when there was a war, then it's very, very good idea to go look at the military records to see whether or not one of your ancestors served in that war. Could have been an uncle, an aunt, or a cousin, or someone who was directly involved. This little ad that came out periodically in the newspapers in the United States during World War I, reminded people that potatoes fight. They save wheat when you eat potatoes, and don't eat bread. I don't think very many of us would have thought that bread and potatoes were kind of equivalent. They both contain starch, et cetera, et cetera. But it was kind of an either or thing. We can't imagine the changes in the lifestyle and the effects that the wars had on the individuals. And so this is what the purpose of my presenting this today was, to highlight kind of my interaction with the wars, and also how they might affect your relatives, and that we need to go out and look for those records and to understand really what was going on in our families, our greater families, extended families. So if you're alive today, I can say this with absolutely surety: someone in your family was directly affected by the First World War. That just goes without saying. The impact of the First World War was felt economically, socially, militarily, politically, all throughout the entire world. Many of the countries of the world that existed previously to the war, to the onset of the war, were realigned. And your ancestors may have been living in a country that is no longer in existence today, because of World War I and the aftermath of the war. And also the boundaries of the countries may have changed. For example, if you look at a map of Europe over a period of the last couple of hundred years, you'll find out that a country like Poland changes the boundaries just regularly, and in some cases disappears entirely, and then comes back as a country. And all of these changes, all of these tremendous impacts that occurred across the world, have a direct relationship to how and where and in what language you're going to find the records that you're trying to find. For example, in Europe, in the eastern part of Europe, which would be east of the current country of Germany, you'll end up having is towns that have three different names: one in German, one in Polish, and one in Russian, for example. And there may be other parts of the world where you have the same types of things. In Africa, maybe almost all of the remnants of the vast empires from Europe have now become independent countries. And so there's entirely different things that have happened. And all of this began an accelerated change when it became in the middle of World War I. So what do you know about your family during the time the war to end all wars? Exactly what out there? Do you even know if they were involved or what impact it had on them? Or maybe they were refugees. Maybe they were immigrants. Maybe they immigrated from the country they lived in to another country because of the war. All of these things. You would think, and this is looking at me personally, my family during World War I was primarily centered, my immediate family, my grandparents and great-grandparents who were alive during World War I, were centered primarily in the western part of the United States. They lived in Utah, and Arizona, and some of the other states. Arizona was a brand new state. It just become part of the Union. And so there's a lot of changes that were going on. And these people were directly affected by the action. And in the United States here, nearly 5 million Americans wore the uniform during that war, and each had an experience that affected their life and the life of their family. So when you take a core of 5 million people and you start to talk about their descendants and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren and their descendants, it's an amazingly not large number of people. And you do that in all of the other countries where people which were affected directly by the war, in France and Germany and the countries where on the continent of Europe where the actual fighting took place. That's where it had a great impact. Here's some of the things that you might look for. Here is a website called the United States World War I Centennial Commission. And they have a tremendous amount of information about what happened during the war, from different types of records that may be and commemorations and things that happened. And so when you begin to start researching the war, then it becomes an interesting part of your life. In my own background and experience, when I was attending the university, I went to the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, and graduated with 4 years. And I happened to graduate in Spanish, so it was just sort of that was my degree. But one of the things that happened was I was involved in what's called the Reserved Officers Training Course. So your ancestor could have been involved in something like that. And or ROTC. And the ROTC was 4 years. So I spent 4 years of my school in classes in ROTC about military history primarily. It ended up at the end of my 4 years of school, actually 3.5 because I got through a little bit earlier, but 3.5 years of school, I had more university study hours in military history than any other subject. So actually, I learned more about military history at the university than I did almost anything else. And since I already knew Spanish, that was just learning a little bit more about Spain and history and literature. And here's one of those stories. I think in order to illustrate how it affected a family or where the records might be, you need to understand at least one story about how it does. And I think this is a good example because a lot of what happened in this story had to do with my involvement with researching my family as a genealogist and being able to look into records and think about the questions that might have occurred because of those records. This is my grandfather. His name was Leroy Parkinson Tanner, and he was born on January 12th, 1895. And if you add that up with the war at times, you'll understand that he was of the prime age to get involved with the wars that happened in the first part of the century and that were involved in the United States. And he lived in, that's him right there, with the rest of, this was his father and his mother and his brothers and sisters. And they lived in a little town, a really small town. When you say a little town, you mean almost non-existently small town called Joseph City, Arizona. And the town is still there due to the fact that one of the power companies built a power, can't say factory, but a power producing facility there in Joseph City or near Joseph City, which is what you kind of see in the background of this photo. And it is, so it's still preserved a little bit, not much. It's a very small place. He grew up in a large family, like you could see there in the photo. And what you don't see is that he had a lot of other brothers and sisters who were half brothers and sisters because his father had 2 wives. In my background, I have ancestors who were known as polygamists. That's not exactly a correct term, but they are people who were married to my grandfathers who were married to more than one woman. So basically, there's a lot of interesting kind of facts and things that you find in your background. He worked on building roads and ranching. It was interesting because he was involved in a construction company with his brothers that became the largest construction company in the state of Arizona and employed more people than any other company. But that company no longer exists. So there's lots of things. And one of the interesting things is I was able to find an entire written history, printed history book about the whole family construction company business. He joined the Arizona National Guard, and he became involved in the Mexican border war between 1910 and 1919. He was early on in that war in 1910, and that particular border war is kind of overlooked in American history. It was a situation during the Mexican Revolution when there were a lot of different political parties and different armies in Mexico who were sort of moving around and attempting to get enough support to take over the country. One of those was run by a person named Pancho Villa. And Pancho Villa was considered a criminal or a bandit by the Americans because he came across the border into the United States and attacked and robbed a couple of towns in the United States. So the United States at the time came back against that and had over called up 5,000 men, including my grandfather. And my grandfather then was in this battle war, which took place on the border between Arizona and Mexico and New Mexico and Mexico. And it was under the command of John J. Pershing. And the reason I mention that is because General Pershing became the Allied commander and the commander of the American forces in Europe during World War I. So he was a very important person during the World War I. Well, apparently, shortly after that, the question arose because we knew that he had been in World War I. This was a family tradition that was handed down. Oh, your grandfather was in World War I. And I saw some of the artifacts. He had a military uniform and some buttons and badges and things that he'd had during the war. And so I was aware that he was in the war. But as a young person and growing up, there was one unfortunate thing is that I really didn't have any contact with when and where he served in World War I or a chance to talk to him because he passed away before I was born. And so I just never got to know him or my grandmother, who also died when my father was only 8 years old. So I didn't know either one of those grandparents, and I never had an opportunity to talk to them or learn about their lives. So I was very interested in finding out more information. And the only thing I really knew as far as a fact was concerned about his participation was that he was in World War I because he had a grave marker in the St. John's City, Arizona City Cemetery. I lived in St. John's when I was very young, when the first, second, and third elementary grades. And then I moved down into Phoenix, which is a bigger city, now a really big city. And I just had no contact with him other than I was in St. John's every summer, and I was very familiar with the cemetery and saw his grave marker. And it said right there on the grave marker when he served, when he was born, when he died, and the unit that he served with. So that started me on some research into what was going on with my grandfathers. So the question is, where do you get this information? And initially, it's the same type of thing that you need to get information for anything you do in genealogy, as that is you start with yourself and your records and those records of people who are most immediately around you. Always there's the question of, well, what if I don't even know who my parents are? Well, the answer to that is much easier to answer today than it was 40 years ago when I started doing genealogy. Because if you go and put your if you take a DNA test with a program like MyHeritage, and you build a family tree on MyHeritage, then MyHeritage will use all of its fabulous and millions of records and fabulous resources through all of the different kinds of connections with records and other things that we don't have time to go into today, to put you in contact with people of your blood relatives. And it's very possible, as many hundreds of people, thousands probably, have now found their families for the first time. But to do this for a war like World War I, you need to have some specific information. And so I looked at the grave marker. Many of the veterans here in the United States, people who participated in the military in the United States are considered to be veterans. And the veterans can receive what is called a grave stipend. In other words, they can get paid a small amount of money by the US government to place a marker on a grave of a veteran. And it's only usually a few $100s, but it can make a difference about whether there is or is not a marker on a particular location. And there's a process you go through to ask to make a request for a grave marker, and then it's authorized. In addition, some of the veterans have the opportunity to be buried in a veterans cemetery. So regardless of what country you're in, you should look at the fact of whether or not there were any benefits paid to veterans, and whether or not the veterans were memorial on their death was marked in some way as a veteran, even if it was a cross or whether it was a Star of David or something on there that would indicate that they had been in the military. And particularly if they're buried in a military cemetery, there should be records at the military cemetery about them. So I started with that. But then the next record that I probably ran across, and this is available on MyHeritage and other websites, is a World War I draft registration card. In order to get enough people, all those millions of people involved in World War I, the United States government and the other governments of the world had to draft people into the Army. That means they didn't have a choice. They had to serve because they were a certain age. And if they didn't serve, they generally had some severe penalty. In the United States, they could be thrown into jail for avoiding the draft or failing to register. And so this is a common card, and it is almost equally as good for identifying the person individually. In fact, it's better in some ways than finding them in the United States Census records, because this tells their correct date of birth. Now, correct, what does that mean? I have run across, unfortunately, a number of people over the years who lied about their age, primarily in this record. The men who are women who lied about their age on the draft. The women were not drafted, but if they joined and lied about their age, they usually overestimated their age. Whereas most of the time when people misrepresent their age, they underestimated. So they appear to be younger than they are. And in this, usually if you see that there's a discrepancy where you think the person was born and that they look like they're 1 or 2 years later, they actually show up with a draft registration that shows them being a little bit older than you expected. And that may be that they tried to get into the Army by misrepresenting their age. Now, Leroy did not have to do that. He was definitely already had been in the Arizona National Guard, had already been out and fought in the border war, and so he was well acquainted with the Army, and he signed up. And interestingly enough, here it tells his employer, who happens to be his father, and it also tells that he had former military experience. Okay, so from this one record, we have a lot of information. We have his birth date. We had that he's a natural born citizen, said he was born here. We have where he's lived most recently, which is extremely helpful in finding him. And we have, at least here, his father's name and his occupation is where he was working, and also that he was single and that he had a previous military experience. So all of those just facts off of this, plus you have a physical description of him if you're interested in that and have never seen a photograph. It's nice to at least know what he kind of looked like. But this is an extremely valuable record for that purpose alone. And all of those suggest further records that could be searched. So here's the MyHeritage representation of that, which tells the information. And then it also helps you to place that into your family tree so that you can use that information in finding other relatives. So, what happened about my grandfather? Well, my grandfather, I mentioned he died before I was born. He was actually killed in a train truck accident in New Mexico when he was hauling some hay, and they went on a train crossing and somehow got hit by a train and killed. And so I spent years. I had the name of his unit, which I got off of the grave marker. I could not find that unit. I went to World War. I did records on World War I of every unit that ever served in World War I. There are records that you can find in the United States, and most of those units have unit histories that are also available. Most of these records, it's hard to say, go here and look for a military record or go there and look for a military record, because some of these military records, they're scattered all over the United States, for example, and all over the world. Valuable records in the United States can be found at various war battle sites. For example, Gettysburg, and in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, there's a tremendous amount of information about that particular battle. So there's just, and they're scattered across in military units and military museums and military history locations all across the world. So this is really an area that is, it's enjoyable, let's say, to do research, because there are so many places to look, and it's so interesting to find out and follow these things. But despite what I could do and the resources that I had, I could not find Leroy Parkinson Tanner in World War I. It just didn't happen. That, notwithstanding his card, and notwithstanding his draft registration, and notwithstanding his grave marker, I just couldn't find it. I couldn't find anything about the unit that he was supposed to have been in. Well, okay, so now what happened? Well, I inherited, basically, you might put it in more colloquial terms, like I got dumped with a lot of the boxes of records from my father. And I started to go through these, never having had any conversations with my father, he never pulled out any records or showed me anything. In other words, I had no idea what was there. And this is what happened, is that I found some very important records. And one of those very important records that I found eventually was that he had filled out, and if you can see my father's name in there someplace. In fact, it's crossed out, because this always just became a long process. He actually made an application for a headstone, and this little card, this is a 3 inch by 5 inch card, 3 by 5, and basically it has all of the entire, and the backside here around all that stuff on the red and around the outside has my grandfather's complete service record. And so here we are with more information just from this one card. Well, it turns out that copies of these cards are also on have been digitized and are available on some of the websites. So you can find these applications for a headstone type records. But the big record that really cleared up where he served and when he served, and instead of that sort of cryptic stuff on the card, was a box of these old letters and documents from my father. And here I found all of my grandfather's discharge records from the United States Army. And I was able to see exactly what happened from the day he was enlisted in the Army, put on active duty in the Army. And then the explanation for why I couldn't find his records was pretty straightforward, because he was not in the Army in a sense. He was actually in the Arizona National Guard, and that had been mobilized for action in World War I, and so he ended up attached to a Army unit out of Texas. And what was other interesting thing that I found out is that he was discharged only shortly before by the time he got completely trained and into service in the Army in 1918, the war had ended. So he basically spent another 6 months or so in the Army and ended up being discharged with all the other troops who were being discharged across the world from their various armies in 1919. Okay, so this cleared up one of the questions was, did he ever go to Europe? And the answer is still not very clear, but he was in the expeditionary force, but he probably didn't get, because that in the middle of this document, you'll see he was AEF from 10, 13, 18. The war ended shortly after that. So that's when he was done. And this is a blow up of that, so you can see that particular thing. So that means the American Expeditionary Force, AEF. Now, here's another point you're going to have to always confront when you do genealogical research into a set of records, and that is you have to face the language and the terminology that's used in those particular records. Same problem if you go to a language that's other than your own language. Same problem if you go to any subject matter where there are very much records. So there's really not a reason to avoid these particular records because of the fact that you might have to learn something, because that's the whole process of doing genealogy. So how did this affect his family? How was his family affected by this? Well, in the real sense, the family was affected because he didn't get married until he's much older than the normal marriageable age for men in a small town in Arizona at that time. He was much older, and his wife, my grandmother, was also considerably older than the average age for getting married. And they were, and they had 2 children before my grandmother died. And he had, and my father and his, because my grandfather was a contractor, he had basically was gone from he married second time and the stepmother. And my father was basically passed around to various relatives during the time he was growing up, which really affected his life and a lot of the things that have happened in our family because of that. He was 28 years old when he got married, and he died, as I mentioned previously, in an accident before I was born. So you should start searching for your own World War I stories. You'll undoubtedly find them, and particularly if you have any relatives who lived in Europe at that time. There was nobody in Europe that wasn't affected. Even if it was just rationing or whether it was some other issue that came, but it was very likely that you'll find those records with this war. So, for example, here, this is a Watertown, Wisconsin newspaper from 1917, and list of men residing in Dodge County. The reason to show this is that one of the really good places to go is to the newspaper records during that time period, during the time of the war. And from before the war, 1916 through 1918, and before and after, because when people left from the town where you were, and they could be your relatives, or came back to the town after the war, or were injured, or were killed during the war, those things showed up in the newspapers. And it's a very, very important way to find out what was going on with these different people. It goes without saying that you need to look for letters, journals, diaries, and talk to your oldest relatives. See if there's anything that was preserved. It's just like the my example with the records from my father that had been sitting in a box for my whole life. And I had no idea that they were there, and literally spent off and on a considerable amount of time over a matter of a couple of years trying to find out more information when it was all sitting in the box in my father's storage room. So this is really, just the kinds of things that you need to address when you start to get really serious about finding information about your relatives and ancestors. One of the things I mentioned is newspapers, and you should be aware that MyHeritage has a fabulous newspaper collection. And one of the most important ones here in the United States is this access to doing record matches for the chronicling the historical American newspapers. And that's the Library of Congress record set. And that is where I found most of my information, personal information about my grandparents and my great-grandparents, all of whom lived in that little town in eastern Arizona, either in St. John's or in Joseph City, the two places where they lived. So just be aware that these newspapers are all there as part of your subscription to MyHeritage. Be sure and look for draft registration cards or the equivalent in any of your countries. The draft military records are, as I mentioned, one set of records that I've become familiar with recently, are the military records in Italy that are at least as good as any of the parish or civil registration records that may exist in that country for finding individuals. Another way to determine about your ancestors is if they all of a sudden show up in a country either right before or during or after a war, and not just World War I, but any major conflict or war. If you don't know the history, you're basically shooting blind and trying, I didn't mean to say that word, you're basically researching blind in your efforts to find these people, because you need to know if they left before the country got into war, during the country was in war as refugees, or after the war as refugees because they couldn't live in the country for some reason, lack of food, for example. It's a good reason. And so knowing when the war was there will give you some perspective. It's really interesting to me that I deal with, I would guess that 90% now lately, during the pandemic, of the people that I've been helping with as consultants from the BYU Family History Library and the Salt Lake Family History Library are people who are looking for an immigrant and trying to find the origin of the immigrant. And some of them fall in these categories. And so you really have to say, there may not have been any records. These people may have been refugees, and it may be very difficult to follow their trail. But knowing that helps you to look in the types of records that you would need to know about. And think about the families. Here's a picture of the family waiting, and they have the portrait. So if you find a picture like this in your family history, you'll see almost immediately that this is an individual family that had a military person, and it may very well be someone who was deceased, or that the picture was taken during that particular conflict. And this certainly looks like a World War I from the dress of the people. Looked like a World War I type of photograph. Okay, well, thanks for watching. I appreciate this opportunity, and I'd be glad to answer any questions. So I'll stop sharing here.
Okay. Great. Wow, that photo was just so touching. That photo at the end where they have the photo of their family members who's serving or who did serve. What a impactful photo. And I'd be interested to see that colorized.
Yeah, well, I was trying to keep some authenticity and originality here. I know it would be more dramatic colorized, but they didn't even have color film back then. So.
Of course. And you know, at MyHeritage, we always believe in the authentic original copies, and we just colorize them to often see added details that we may have missed, or to just imagine what it looked like in our own.
The impact from the colorized photos is just overwhelming. I mean, we've had people just break into tears the first time they see somebody, in color. It's just amazing. But yeah, from a historical archival perspective, I have to keep saying we want the original.
Of course. So James, just so many nice comments here about how informative this session was. Joan says, this was so interesting. Thank you so much. Barb says over here, very informative. Nancy says, thank you. So just so many words of thanks. It was just so interesting. What an interesting session. And I have a whole bunch of questions. Before I get to the questions, just a few comments that we received from our viewers. Connie says, my father served in World War II and he was a prisoner of war in Germany. Barb said, I found out my great-great-grandfather is buried in Arlington Cemetery.
Oh.
Let's see. Diane says, my father was in the Korean War and was a paratrooper, so I've read. I cannot find any of this info.
Well, that's an interesting point.
Sure.
One thing that I found over the years in doing research, particularly into some of the wars, is that a lot of the survivors, particularly if they had a really bad experience, they just won't talk about it. Not at all. They won't say a word. You could ask them questions, they would just say nothing. At one point, I was doing some research into Korean War veterans and gathered a lot of information about the survivors of the Korean War. And the most common comment from the relatives was, we never heard anything. We didn't know our father was in the war. He never said anything about it. And so I think that's something that you'll have to, you always run into, is that if they had such a terrifying and horrific experience, they weren't going to tell everybody about it. They didn't talk.
I'm sure that was just so common.
No, it is very common.
These experiences. Let's see, Rosemary has a question. She said, my uncle was arrested after stealing a general's Jeep from Omaha, Nebraska, and taking it to a base in Connecticut, where he was arrested by the FBI. A few months later, he was discharged or kicked out. I would think a dishonorable discharge, but I can't find anything about that.
When was this? The time period would be important. One of the things in the United States that you need to understand about military records, and basic, and I didn't get into all this background with U.S. military records, but the government repository, which was part of the National Archives for military records, is in St. Louis, Missouri. And I can't give you the date of the fire, but there was a huge fire in the 1970s, I don't know the exact date, that destroyed most of the enlistment and records of anyone from the end of World War I up until into the 1970s. And in fact, my enlistment records were probably destroyed in that fire. So there's a big gap. Over the years, the Army has created a lot of other records that are can be substitute for that, but it may be a little bit difficult. But there's lots of places to get started with, and the place in that particular instance to get started is where he was serving at the time, to see if there's any kind of record there of the people who served at that base. A lot of times, just serving at a base has been recorded and is available in the unit histories and military histories that are kept in individual bases in the United States. So I served, for example, for a time at Fort Knox, and there's a museum and archive at Fort Knox. So you go lots of different places to find these records.
Rosemary said it was during World War II.
Yeah, well, a lot of those records are the ones that got lost in the fires.
What a shame. What a shame. Let's see. We have a question here from Barbara. She said, I think my grandfather, Charles Coates Taylor, was in the Merchant Marines in World War I. Would that be under the U.S. Navy?
No, the Merchant Marine is a separate organization from the United States Navy. It's the U.S. Merchant Marine, and they have their own archives and their own records. So yes, if he also joined the Navy, that would be something else, if he was also in the Navy at the time. But the Merchant Marine would be under those Merchant Marine records. So if you go to, just do a general Google search for Merchant Marine records, you'll start into it with all the references and everything there is. I could illustrate that in 2 or 3 minutes, but that's not part of this, what we're doing. And so basically, yes, but they would be there. They were not technically military. They were private citizens. They weren't part of the military in a sense.
Oh, okay. Pat asks, my great uncle Jeffrey Shuren died November 11th, 1918, Armistice Day in France. He is buried in France. Where can I find pictures? He was just ready to get his lieutenant's bars.
Well, you'd be really fortunate if you can identify the unit, which probably if he's buried there and you know anything about the burial, his registration at that particular cemetery will be available to give you and will have the unit he served in. Then if you go looking for that unit's military history, for the history, you may find that they have whole reams of history about the unit and who died and when and who they were. And they will probably have an archive someplace for that particular unit, and that would be the place to look for pictures.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have for questions today. Some really excellent stories here in the comment section. For anyone in the audience who hasn't taken a look already, I suggest that you read over these stories. It's just so great to read about all these heroes who have fought for their country and the different units that they served in. So I suggest that you all read them. And our winner for today's MyHeritage Complete Plan, the best plan that we have to offer on MyHeritage, with free and unlimited access to 13 billion historical records, to all of our photo tools, to advanced DNA tools, and so much more. So the winner today is Amy Drown Harris. And Amy wrote us, and she said, my father was in the United States Army during World War II, as well as both of his older brothers. My maternal uncle was in the Army Air Corps in World War II. Pretty much in every conflict of this country, an ancestor has fought in. My husband was in Vietnam in the U.S. Army, and our youngest son is in the Air Force Reserves. He served in Operation Enduring Freedom. So, Amy, thank you so much for your family's service, and you should be really, really proud of each and every one of them. It's quite incredible, and thank you for sharing that comment with us. And we'll be in touch with you through private message to claim your prize. James, thank you so much for joining us today. That presentation was just incredible and so informative. I think we all just learned so much. For anyone who missed parts of it or who wants to rewatch any of it, just to remind you all that you can rewatch all of our Facebook Lives, including this one, on the MyHeritage Facebook page, facebook.com/MyHeritage, under the videos section. So James, thank you again for joining us, for taking the time, and what an amazing presentation. And thank you to all of you in our audience for joining us today. We hope that you all we hope you all have a great day. Bye.
Bye.